Hey guys, I know a lot of you have been waiting for this video. It's going to be the Google Nexus 5 versus the Google Nexus 4. The software I'm running on both is stock, so stock ROM and stock kernel. It's a fair test. I've updated my Nexus 4 to Android 4.4 KitKat, so yeah, here we go. So LG and Google decided to shrink the bezels on the front of the Nexus 5, which is a welcome addition and makes it look sleeker and more polished than the Nexus 4. If we turn around, you can see the materials used are different here as well. The back of the Nexus 4 is glass and you can see that kind of pattern. The Nexus 5 is a soft touch plastic, which doesn't quite look as pretty as the Nexus 4, but it is more protective and it feels nice in the hand. So if we check this out, you'll see the Nexus 5 is a little bit taller than the Nexus 4. I think it's around 4mm taller, and if we put them on top of each other, it's again a little bit wider, coming in at 69.2mm versus 68.7. Not that you'd really notice that. The Nexus 5 comes in with a thickness of 8.6mm versus the Nexus 4's 9.1, so it is a thinner device, and that really does help when you're holding it. It is noticeable. The Nexus 5 is 9 grams lighter than the Nexus 4, and this is probably the biggest difference between the two that you'll notice in your hand. It feels noticeably lighter and it's just easier and nicer to hold. The Nexus 5 has a full 1080p display versus the Nexus 4's 768p display. While it's not as big a difference as going from a non-HD screen to a HD screen, the difference is there and things are a little bit sharper on the Nexus 5 screen. Text is a little bit sharper in the browser and pretty much throughout the whole UI, and of course you can run your 1080p videos natively on the Nexus 5. In terms of the colour reproduction, I do think the Nexus 5 wins here. I think it just looks a little bit more natural. There's a slight green tint on the fur on the Nexus 4. That's not present on the Nexus 5, and you can just see a little bit more detail on the Nexus 5 as well. In terms of the brightness level for both of these devices, we'll just go ahead and dive into the brightness, turn it up to full so we can see the difference. And I'm pretty sure this is coming through on the camera, but the Nexus 5 does have the brighter screen, and that's going to make it better for outdoor viewing in sunlight and things like that. So both these devices being Nexus means they get the latest version of Android pretty quickly, and you can see they're both running Android 4.4 KitKat. However, there are some differences. The Nexus 5 has an exclusive Google Edition launcher. You can see there's some transparency differences here. There's also some differences in the folders. You can see they're slightly redesigned, and it has a transparent status bar that the Nexus 4 doesn't have. If we dive into the settings here, the Nexus 4 pretty much gets the rest of the KitKat features, for example tap and pay and the printing options, but it does miss out on the Google Edition launcher, so you can't swipe all the way over for Google Now. That isn't possible. That also means you do miss out on the OK Google feature, and you can just say OK Google. From the home screen, you can see it activates without touching it. You don't get that on the Nexus 4 because it is included in the launcher. There are also some other differences with the Nexus 5. If we jump into the app drawer, you'll notice a semi-transparent app drawer versus the black background of the Nexus 4. The grid size is also a little bit different, and the icon size is different as well on the Nexus 5, and that's all to do with that Google Edition launcher. If we tap and hold the home screen, you'll see that it's also a little bit different. You get that old style on the Nexus 4, you get a new style on the Nexus 5, and it has different wallpapers as well. So you do get a slightly different KitKat experience on the Nexus 5. That being said, the Google Edition launcher can be sideloaded on the Nexus 4, but officially it isn't available. So moving on to performance here, the Nexus 5 has a Snapdragon 800, which is a quad-core processor clocked at 2.3 GHz. It's also accompanied by the Adreno 330 GPU. The Nexus 4 has a Snapdragon S4 Pro, which is a quad-core processor clocked at 1.5 GHz and is accompanied by the Adreno 320 GPU. So on paper, the Nexus 5 is the stronger device. We'll have to see how that translates to real-world performance and UI performance a little bit later. Right now, we're doing a boot-up test. The Nexus 5 did shut down quicker than the Nexus 4, and it looks like it's a little bit ahead in booting up as well. In terms of the amount of apps, I've pretty much got the same apps on both. So this is a pretty fair test. Let's see what happens. And Nexus 5 is done. And about 10 seconds later, the Nexus 4. In terms of the UI performance, both of these are buttery smooth, and if we do a little task here, you'll see that they're pretty much identical in terms of their overall speed. I can't tell the difference between them. They're going through menus with pretty much identical speed, and they're really hard to tell apart. So let's go ahead and open up some apps. So here we go with opening these apps, and you'll see that again, they're very similar to each other. If you're being really sharp-eyed, you'll see that the Nexus 5 is loading the app a little bit before the Nexus 4, but honestly, there really isn't much between them here. Both are very, very quick. You're not going to notice. Some of this stuff could just be down to network bottlenecks and stuff like that. App opening looks to be a hair quicker on the Nexus 5, but that's about it. Lastly, we're going to check out the camera opening speed. Ever so slightly quicker on the Nexus 5, but really not much difference in app opening between them at all. So a better test to actually gauge performance between these two devices is to load up a game and see which one can load it first. So let's see what happens here. Nexus 5 is done. And about 13 to 14 seconds later, the Nexus 4 is done. So a much bigger gap there than what we're seeing in the app opening speeds. You'll also notice I'm running FPS meter on both, and notice the Nexus 5 has a much higher frame rate than what the Nexus 4 is getting on the same game. Even though the Nexus 5 has a higher resolution screen, that Adreno 330 GPU is just better than the Adreno 320, and it can push a higher frame rate, and it's quite noticeable right here. So showing this game is a much more accurate reading of the performance difference between these two devices, especially in gaming. If you're someone that's into gaming a lot, you're going to be a lot better off with the Nexus 5. Moving on to the web browser performance here, we're just going to load up a few sites. We've got The Verge first and see what happens. Don't forget they're on the same Wi-Fi, so that could account for some differences. Nexus 5 is done. Nexus 4 is quite a little bit behind here. We'll load up the full site, see if there's any difference. There was quite a big difference in loading there. Nexus 5 is done. And the Nexus 4 is done. So you can see the Nexus 5 is quite a bit quicker in the web browsing. You can see the Nexus 4 still has that delay about recognizing the pinch to zoom gesture. Thankfully, the Nexus 5 doesn't have that issue. It's a lot more responsive with your fingers closer together. We'll test out another website here. We'll load up Engadget. Nexus 5 is in the lead. Nexus 5 is done. Followed by the Nexus 4, probably a second, 2 seconds later, so not that big a difference there, but it still was a hair quicker. And lastly, we'll try Droid Life. So we're done on the Nexus 5, that was very quick. And the Nexus 4 is done, so you can see there the Nexus 5 is a very quick and snappy browser, and honestly, while using it, it does feel noticeably quicker than the browser on the Nexus 4, even though I'm using the same Chrome beta. So yeah, the better experience is on the Nexus 5 here. And lastly here, we wanted to check out the camera. Now, both of these are 8 megapixel shooters, but the Nexus 5 has a larger pixel size, so it can let in more light and more detail, and it has optical image stabilization. Now, we'll start off with the Nexus 4, and we'll take a picture of this PS3 controller. Try and notice how quick it can focus and how quick it can take a picture as well, and we'll see if the Nexus 5 is any different. Okay, and it's done. We'll check out this picture a little bit later, and we'll compare it to the Nexus 5's. Let's just grab the Nexus 5 and take this same shot here. Load it up and take. So in all honesty, the focus time doesn't seem much better to me. It seems to take the same amount of time. Let's check out the actual image. And wow, that is quite a big difference. The Nexus 5, in my opinion, did a much better job at producing a much better image. You can see it's got the colors right. The image is a little bit sharper as well. The clarity is better. The Nexus 4 got the colors all wrong. And I had all the settings on automatic, so it was the same for both devices. It just got it completely wrong. It was like the white balance was completely messed up and washed out. Just not a very nice image on the Nexus 4. Now, even though these are on different screens, it wouldn't produce this much of a massive difference. So, hands down, the Nexus 5 is a much better camera than the Nexus 4. It's not the best camera out right now, but it's a big upgrade over what we had. And you can just see it's a much better image in pretty much every aspect. And lastly here, we've got a Geekbench result. I just did this for a bit of fun. We knew the Nexus 5 would win with its Snapdragon 800, but yeah, you can see there are some differences, especially in the gaming and camera area, so it really depends what you use your device for as to whether you need to upgrade your device or not. But yeah, the Nexus 4 can still hold up pretty well against devices being released right now, which when you think about it is really impressive considering it is a year old. Let me know what you guys think. Peace out.